climbs off all right by itself. It does it itself. Okay?
Yeah, you're right there with me though.
Every time I open the hangar door to go flying, I realize that I'm one of the lucky guys doing something that I dreamt of as a kid.
Vietnam is a sliver, a ribbon of a country on the South China Sea. It's bordered by China, Laos, and Cambodia. Until 1954, it was part of French Indochina. That's when Ho Chi Minh, the communist and nationalist leader, defeated the French and sent them packing back to France. Ho Chi Minh then looked to unify the country under his rule. A Geneva Convention agreement put a hold on that and split the country in two, similar to what had happened just a year earlier in Korea. The split was supposed to be temporary, but a planned election never happened. The North stayed communist, while the South, backed by the United States, wanted democracy. In the late 1950s, President Eisenhower started sending military advisors to help the South defend itself. President Kennedy continued to send in more troops, and by 1963, 16,000 American fighters were in South Vietnam. In early August 1964, 2 North Vietnamese attacks on U.S. ships in the Tonkin Gulf were reported. The second attack never happened, but President Johnson used the report to get broad military powers for himself to expand America's combat role in Vietnam. By the end of 1965, almost 200,000 American troops were in the South. By 1969, the total had jumped to 543,000. America's combat role lasted another 8 years. It was fought from the air and on the ground, often in deadly jungle fighting. More than 58,000 Americans were killed, more than 300,000 were wounded, not counting those who were mentally maimed. Of the total population of both Vietnams, 40 million people, estimates indicate as many as 1 million Vietnamese died, another 3 million Vietnamese were wounded. Low and slow, unprotected little airplanes did intelligence gathering and targeting over enemy territory, and attack helicopters took the fight to the Viet Cong. A pilot who flew both planes joins us now to reveal the challenges and the risks of his duty to our country. Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you. Thanks very much. Good morning. Braving the rain. Please welcome 2 Army aviators, Bill Reeder and Jack McCormick. Gentlemen. Bill? Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, good morning, guys.
Good morning.
Good morning, Bill.
Just a quick background about Bill and Jack. 30 years active duty, Bill Reeder, 30 years active duty. He retired as a colonel. In 2014, he was inducted into the Army Aviation Hall of Fame. In 2007, he was the Army Aviator of the Year. His first tour was flying this airplane, the OV-1, over Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam. His second tour, he flew this airplane, was shot down, and after several months in captivity, wound up in the Hanoi Hilton and in early 1973 was released along with his 579 other compadres who were POWs at the time. So that's a brief background, along with the 3,000 hours, the 1,000 in combat, highly decorated, 2 DFCs, Silver Star, Air Medal for Valor, 3 Purple Hearts, POW medal. This is Colonel Bill Reeder.
Thank you.
Jack McCormick, Army Aviator, flew 1,204 combat hours, earned the DFC, the Air Medal with 42 oak leaf clusters, the Bronze Star, the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry. This is Jack McCormick. Bill, I just mentioned you flew both these airplanes. What was it like when you walked out here this morning and stood between these 2 airplanes?
I'm glad that we did that earlier and I got that emotion out of my system, or it would be difficult to be talking right now. This was extraordinary. Probably, at least in my mind, the 2 finest aircraft that Army Aviation has ever had, and I had the opportunity, indeed the joy, to fly both during my career.
All right, your first tour flying, as I just mentioned, over Laos, Cambodia, North Vietnam. What were your missions? What were you doing, to the extent that you can talk about any of it?
And during the Vietnam War, we had 5 Mohawk companies in Vietnam. One of each of the 4 companies was dedicated to a section of South Vietnam. The 5th company, and that was mine, was stationed at Hue Phu Bai, South Vietnam, but the only time we saw South Vietnam was for takeoffs and landings. All of our missions were out-of-country missions. We were tasked specially for special intelligence missions, the results of which went all the way to the National Command Authority. Our missions were all in Laos and off the coast of North Vietnam, with a few very special missions into Cambodia.
Now, were you weaponized at the time, or was this all purely intel?
We had 3 models of the Mohawk, A, B, and C. The C models were infrared, the B models were side-looking airborne radar, the A models were armed OV-1s. The reason for the armament was we did special daytime reconnaissance over the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos. It was a very high-threat environment with a lot of AAA. We lost a lot of aircraft. Those missions went out in teams of 2, and those aircraft were armed principally for self-defense.
Now, your second tour, you were flying this airplane, yes? Yep. Cobra. What were your missions of the Cobra? What, on a day-to-day basis?
Our unit, our Cobra unit, was a pure Cobra helicopter unit, 21 Cobras, 361st Aerial Weapons Company. Our mission was specifically dedicated to the support of MACV SAW operations, and that mission involved the support of special.
What happened here? Yeah. No, it's not you. It's not you.
Okay.
Yeah, keep going.
All right. Okay.
Yeah,
now I'm back.
Yeah,
the missions were in support of MACV SOG, which essentially stood for MACV Special Operations Group. It was actually the Studies and Observation Group, but we supported the insertion and extraction of small 2 to 3 U.S., 6 to 8 indigenous teams that did special reconnaissance over the border in along the Ho Chi Minh Trail and other special missions within South Vietnam for reconnaissance, special reconnaissance, and some direct action missions.
May 9, 1972, big day for you.
Yes.
And your colleagues. What happened?
I had arrived in country on my second tour flying Cobras, and I guess just a very brief, how did I get from that to that? It's because I love the guns, and you pointed out the armament, the gunship qualities of that. Between my Vietnam tours, when the Army sent me back to get a college degree, finish up my bachelor's degree, they had taken the guns off of the Mohawks. So I knew going back to Vietnam that I would not be flying armed Mohawks on my second tour. I asked the Army if I could please get a helicopter transition and Cobra qualification, which they granted me. So I went back enthusiastically flying Cobras, so I could continue my gunship experience on my second tour.
Hearing you use the word enthusiastically, what was your attitude at the time? How old were you at the time? About?
Going back on my second tour of duty, I was 25 years old. On my first tour of duty, I was 22 years old.
And what was your
I love it here. These airplanes are great. This is fantastic.
What was your attitude about going into combat in Vietnam?
Well, okay, and I guess I was going to say I may be unique, but I'm not. Among the guys that I served with in both units, there was a lot of enthusiasm. But we were a type of young American youth at the time that were enthusiastic about life. And it's a little hard to recall now, but when we first entered the Vietnam War, it was a popular war that had a lot of support. So when I enlisted in the Army to serve, there was a lot of support of going in. So I entered service enthusiastically. I continued that enthusiasm throughout my service. I'm a pretty positive person by nature, though, and I love getting into the Mohawk. It at the time was the most advanced aircraft that the Army had. It was fully acrobatic, would do loops and rolls, and then to top it off, the frosting on the cake was it was armed with pod-mounted 50 caliber machine guns and 2.75 rockets. You know, the war is terrible, and there are a lot of moments of terror, and people were killed, and guys in my unit were lost, and sister units. But there's still that thrill of combat for a young man. And I enjoyed flying guns, and I was enthusiastic about getting into the Cobra and flying that mission on a second tour.
May 9, 72, what happened?
Okay, May 9th, 1972, I was several months into my second tour of duty. When I arrived in South Vietnam, we all thought the war was over, and surprisingly today we thought it was over and that we had won because the communist insurgency in the South had been fairly well defeated. But in the spring of 1972, the enemy launched an offensive with divisions out of North Vietnam attacking into South Vietnam. It became known as the Easter Offensive of '72. And things started falling apart quickly in the South, and the North Vietnamese began gaining territory. On the 9th of May 1972, I was dispatched on a tactical emergency mission just after first light in the morning to go and support U.S. forces that were trying to withstand enemy tank and infantry attacks. There were the elements of over 2 North Vietnamese divisions involved in these attacks in the Central Highlands. And on this morning, one particular fire base, an old Special Forces camp at a place called Ben Het, was under attack by thousands of infantry, by many tanks, and they were in a bad way, and we got launched out to provide Cobra gunship support for them that morning. That mission, as it turned out, was the one I was shot down, evaded capture for 3 days, captured, and then spent nearly a year, 11 months in captivity as a prisoner of war.
So that was your third mission that day when you got shot down. When you spiraled down, how badly were you injured, and what about your crewmate?
Yeah, the aircraft took hits from multiple anti-aircraft positions, and we were right on the deck, right on the treetops, covering a Huey that was trying to get some resupply of anti-tank ammo and other ammo to these guys on the ground that we had been providing gun support for that morning. Yeah, third mission was right. Very intense, a lot of anti-aircraft. 23 millimeter, 37 millimeter, 50 caliber, 51 caliber anti-aircraft machine guns. So the fire was intense. As we went in there, the aircraft, as I said, was hit from multiple anti-aircraft positions and shot out the tail rotor, rounds to the engine, rounds to the cockpit. So the aircraft was out of control, spinning and burning, and hit the ground with a.
How badly were you hurt?
I had my back was broken badly, which I didn't know at the time. I never knew that till I got released. In my mind, in those days, if a guy's back is broken, you can't move. But somehow I was able to get out of the cockpit, as was my front seater, and make my way a short distance in the aircraft before I passed out. And then when I came to, I couldn't move at all for quite some time. There was damage, that much damage to my back. Later that day, I was able to get up and crawl a bit, and then by the evening to be able to walk in a very hunched over position. So I had my broken back, I had a shell fragment wound in my ankle, I had superficial wounds in my face that were bleeding a lot, and I was burned on the back of my neck from the explosion.
So you evaded for 3 days before they finally got you.
I evaded capture for 3 days, and it might seem unusual that we weren't able to get a rescue in there and get me out, There was a lot of enemy in the areas I described, elements of 2 North Vietnamese divisions. The senior ranking American at the time, a gentleman named John Paul Vann, directed that there would not be a concerted rescue attempt because he was worried about losing other aircraft and other personnel trying to get us out. And I, in retrospect, do think that he was right. However, that evening, some of the guys from my unit and B Troop 717th Cav went out on what they justified to be an armed reconnaissance, just a mission, but in that mission tried to get in and get us out. They did successfully get my front seat out, but they were not able to get me out, so I then went for the next, total of 3 days before I was captured. My front seater, regrettably, though he was recovered, died on the way to the hospital, and he did not survive.
How were you treated when you went to your first POW camp? How many days before you got there, and how were you treated, and what was that like?
Well, when they captured me, I was initially treated just, they had a prisoner. They didn't know what to do with me. They took me into a military encampment, a assembly area that the enemy had, the North Vietnamese, and sat me up against a tree and just left me guarded for much of the rest of the afternoon. But late that afternoon, an interrogator had been acquired from somewhere. He was an English-speaking North Vietnamese, I think probably junior intelligence officer, and he began an interrogation that involved beatings, involved some ropes on my arms, tied my arms behind my back, and this went on, tightening ropes, asking questions. Eventually the ropes were pulled so tight that my elbows touched in the back and both my shoulders dislocated. That was some of the kind of treatment that I endured for those first 3 days of captivity before I was moved to a prison camp.
So what was it like at that prison camp?
The prison camp was a 3-day march from my point of capture, where this initial interrogation took place. I was given my boots back to make that march with no socks and no laces. So by the time I got to that first prison camp, my feet were like raw hamburger, just, you can imagine, boots with no laces or no socks. The camp was a very crude jungle prison camp. There was a fence around the outside that I sometimes likened to an image in my mind of an old frontier army post in the American West, but instead of logs for the perimeter, it was pieces of bamboo that formed the perimeter. As we got close on the entry, I could see that there were indeed 2 concentric fences around the perimeter of the camp, and there was a ditch or moat dug between these 2 fences, about 6 or 8 feet deep. To enter the camp, we had to go across a flattened log. I've described my condition. My balance wasn't good. I was a mess, and I was very concerned about getting across this log because as we approached it, I saw that in the bottom of the trench, in the bottom of the moat, were what we called punji stakes. They're pieces of bamboo sharpened on both ends, one end usually dipped in human waste. The thing stuck in the ground, the point, the stake sticking up. If you fall, if the puncture doesn't kill you, the infection that you get will. But I just set my eyes on the other side of that log and pushed on through and got into the camp. Now I get to the answer to the question, what was that camp like? Inside that camp were a number of bamboo cages, and they were not unlike some of the stereotypical image and some of the representations we see of a bamboo cage in the jungle. I saw that there were several cages. I was to learn that there were about 300 prisoners in that camp. All of the prisoners were South Vietnamese and indigenous mountain yard personnel, people who had been captured by the North Vietnamese. I was also to learn later there was 1 other American in that camp, so out of those 300, 2 Americans. The cages were varying sizes. The first one that I was put in was shortly inside the entrance. It was about 12 feet wide, maybe 20, 24 feet long. It was only about 4.5 feet high though. That's a lot of space, but inside that space were a couple of dozen South Vietnamese prisoners and myself. So we were packed in there like sardines. Down the middle of that cage was a log that had been split longitudinally. and in the log there were holes cut so it would serve as wooden stocks, kind of like you see at Williamsburg, Virginia, when you go in the old colonial times, and they put our feet in those stocks and then close the top of the log down, so we would, that's how we'd sit all day with our feet in those stocks. We would get 2 meals a day. The meal was about a grapefruit-sized ball of rice pressed together. That was it. We'd get one about mid-morning and one in the mid to late afternoon. That was all the food we got. We'd get water delivered in a piece of bamboo hollowed out that they'd pass around for water. I don't remember water being a problem. That diet, though, was a problem with that's all there was to eat. And then we'd be allowed out of the cage once a day for about 5 minutes to use the camp latrine facility. It was nothing more than a mound of human waste in the corner of the camp, and it was disgusting, but it was also the source of a lot of infection and disease, having to walk around in that stuff to use the latrine. Yeah,
so you were there for a while, but then you started this many-month trek north to Hanoi and the Hanoi Hilton. Describe that trek.
That camp was really bad conditions. In those stocks with my broken back, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't lay back, so I had to sleep sitting up. And there were rats in there that would bite our wounds. Oh, it was terrible. People were dying daily in the camp, and so I'm sure that I would not have survived for very much longer in that camp. A decision was made to move key prisoners north, and that was going to include myself and the other American, and about 24 South Vietnamese officers who were prisoners. On July the 2nd, they pulled us out of our cages and put those who were going to make the trip in a row, and I found myself standing there with the other American, and I said a couple dozen South Vietnamese. One of the South Vietnamese translated for us this little speech that was given by the communist camp commander. The speech essentially was, we're going to move you to a new camp where conditions will be better. It's going to be a difficult journey. It could take as long as 11 days. You should try very hard to make it. That try very hard to make it didn't register fully in my mind until we got well into that first day. But they tied our arms behind our backs, but loosely this time. They tied us together with about a, 6-8 foot length of rope between us. They did not give us our boots back. We were barefoot and set out through the jungle on this 11-day trip to a new camp that we thought was going to be somewhere in the jungles of South Vietnam or
So
Cambodia.
how long did the 11-day trek take?
Yeah, I got a few hours into the first day, and I said, how in the hell am I ever going to survive this? How am I going to make it? It was very tough, very difficult. My condition had deteriorated. I had lost a lot of weight. My ankle wound had become badly infected. I was in a bad way, but nonetheless, I struggled through that first day and made it to the end of that day. And then every day after that, I tried my best and somehow got through each day. I had no idea how I was going to make it for 11 days. I didn't think I could, but I was going to give it everything I got. That 11-day journey turned out not to be a trip of several days to a new camp in the jungles of South Vietnam, Laos, or Cambodia. It turned out to be over a 3-month trip, all the way up the Ho Chi Minh Trail, eventually all the way to the city of Hanoi, where I was placed into the regular prison system in Hanoi. Along the way, about a half a dozen of the South Vietnamese died. The other American died, and I damn near died on several occasions before we finally finished that trip.
How was the treatment in the Hanoi Hilton compared to what you'd already been through?
Yeah, the treatment in the Hilton, it was, it's interesting because so many guys who were captured in the north before I was in the early years had very bad treatment in Hanoi, even in the prison system there. But by the time I got to Hanoi and got placed in that prison system in October of 1972, conditions had improved dramatically. So for me, I was home free once I got to Hanoi. All I had to do was endure till the war ended and I was released.
Right. Looking back over that whole experience, Bill, how do you account for the fact that you were able to hang in and make it?
Yeah. I don't know, because so many guys didn't. And it's really tough. I attribute it to a few things as I've looked back. And, I just wrote a book, Through the Valley, My Captivity in Vietnam, and I dwell on that a little bit in the book, too, to think back on what helped me survive. I think a big part of it is attitude. I've always been positive, optimistic, sometimes a little too much so for some of my family members, drive my wife crazy sometimes, but I'm a positive guy. And then I contrast that with the other American that was with me, who was actually in better shape than I was when we started that trek north. But his attitude was not as positive as mine, and in the end his attitude began to play a role on his will to survive. So I think attitude's important. Faith was important to me. Faith in God, faith in family, and faith in my country. I never for a minute thought that I would be abandoned by the United States of America. And even after I got to Hanoi, I felt if the war went on and they could not reach an agreed truce, that I would see the parachutes of the 101st Airborne Division coming down over Hanoi. And the 101st was airborne at that time, they're not anymore, would see the 101st coming in to get the prisoners out of Hanoi. So I always maintained faith. And then I think another thing is, and it ties, I guess, to my positive attitude, I think it's important to be able to maintain a sense of humor. And that may seem odd, but from my experience, the worse things get, the more important it is to find some humor in circumstances around you and be able to smile to yourself.
Well, Jack, he used the word enthusiastically a few minutes ago about going to Vietnam. When you realized you were going to Vietnam, what was your attitude about taking part in the war?
David, you know, you have 40, 50 years to reflect. Much like Bill, you get, things become very poignant, I guess. But I remember basically not having any problem at all with going to the war. I mean, the Army kind of puts you in a place sometimes where you just do what you're told. But and let me stop for just a second. What a story, right? I wish they had let me go first. We had some folks that ended up being prisoners, and we looked for them for a long time. And I remember watching the TV shows, might have been the day you were released, when they would show the names at the end of the news. And I finally saw those two guys' names, and it was like a breath of something had come out of me. But back to the question, David. We basically just operated like young people will operate, and we just took it, as Bill said, one day at a time. They'd hand you a mission sheet. You had this stuff to do today. You'd go do it. Some days it got a little exciting. Some days it didn't. But for the most part, I don't ever remember thinking enthusiasm. But I guess really we did have it. Yeah. You flew Hueys. I did.
Assault units, assault helicopters, right?
Correct.
What does that mean? What missions fall under that umbrella of assault helicopters?
In the 1st Cavalry Division, they would divide each battalion, and you'd have one company. There'd be 4 companies. One company would be devoted to aerial gunnery support. There was always in our division there was a heavy lift group that was the Chinook helicopters, the twin rotor things, and then you had 2 Huey outfits, one specifically tasked with resupply missions, and the other one was combat assault. I just happened to end up with Charlie Company of the 229th, and that's what we did. So we were the guys that would go in formations of 7 to sometimes more helicopters. And we'd pick the troops up in a secure location. We'd have a mission planned to take them from one part of the area of operation to the other, and we'd insert those guys into a non-secure area, which basically involved a lot of pre-planning and preparation using artillery and various other things that would ensure at least a safe arrival for them. Once they got them on the ground, it was up to them to defend themselves. But our job was just that combat assault role.
Now, you were on the Cambodian border, yes? Near the Cambodian border?
Right. The unit had moved from the what they called I Corps, had moved down from the northern part of Vietnam after the 68 offensive. And we took up residence in a little place called Tay Ninh, which was in that picture of Vietnam. It was down in the southern fat part, kind of out on the Cambodian border. And that's where we operated out of.
So what were the rules? To what extent were you able to go into Cambodia?
We weren't allowed to go into Cambodia until May 1st of 1970.
Okay, there we are. May 1st, 1970. What happened?
May Day.
Yeah.
President Nixon had decided that we needed to interdict into Cambodia to get a little more control over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And of course, as Bill mentioned, there was a lot of fingers of it that joined up there. So they authorized us to go into Cambodia.
Let me interrupt on this side. Explain, in the introduction, we showed the sliver of Vietnam, and there's Cambodia and Laos. And explain the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Why was it so important? What was going on that the North Vietnamese were doing on the Ho Chi Minh Trail?
Dear goodness, I just read some new information that I hadn't read before, but the North Vietnamese, with the help of the Russians, Chinese, and all that, they had to keep a supply line going. And as they developed this guerrilla, if you will, operation in the southern part of Vietnam, the idea was they had to keep things moving to them. And the biggest mistake that we made in pressing this war was we somehow thought that we could stop that if we just blew enough stuff up, it would work. They could rebuild that, hack out a new trail overnight. It took nothing for them to do that. But it was the major supply line into the southern part of the country. Right. And they moved a lot of stuff.
All right, so May 1st, 1970. What was the mission? How big was it? How many helicopters?
Oh, I've still got the mission sheet at home. We started out the day with knowing where we were going to pick people up. But the landing zones, which would normally be coordinates or something on a map, those were basically listed as to be determined, which meant that it was a secret. And we left, I can't remember, the first couple of missions were fairly benign. We were moving people into position, but we got them all located in a large installation right up on the border called Quan Loy. It was right next to the Michelin rubber plantation. As a matter of fact, that's where your tires come from. But we started hauling these people out. And we knew we were going to go deep into Cambodia. There was a limit, 23 kilometers or something like that. But we knew we were going deep in. And the idea was we had to get as big a force on the ground at one time as possible. The largest formation that we took part in that day had 48 Hueys and 18 Cobra gunships escorting him.
How unusual was that many airplanes?
Oh, I had never seen anything like it. It looked like D-Day or something. We normally operated in 5 to 7 ship formations. But what they did, they just took different companies and combined them together, put one flight leader out in front of us, and we just followed him. We crossed the Cambodian border. Previously, we had done a lot of extraction of ammunition and supplies and food that had been stored there for the next assault. They found that, and so we were one of the few units that literally really knew where the border was. We worked there every day, right? And I remember crossing the border thinking, is this the right thing to do? But
you had another mission that was a resupply mission that went south on you. What happened that day later?
Oh, well, that was the extraction. Actually, we had some troops that, frankly, it was a very benign mission. We were just going in for a single lift, a single sortie extraction. 7 ships, literally 10 kilometers from our base camp. It was basically in what we thought was a secure area, if there was anything like that in Vietnam. We made our approach realizing that we were going to extract everybody out at one time, which meant there was nobody we were the only defense that we had. And of course we had our Cobras standing by if we needed it. And that just turned into a situation. They started getting contact as the last groups were coming out of the tree lines, and we had to stay there, obviously, to do what we were supposed to do. And I was the last, maybe second to last ship out.
How many people were you able to pull out of there? And how much did you get shot up?
I didn't take any hits that day. We got shot out quite a bit, but for some reason I didn't take any hits. But we probably pulled, I guess that was 7 ships, we probably pulled 45 or 50 guys out in that one lift. And of course there again, like I say, it got exciting there at the end when we suddenly realized that we couldn't let the Cobras shoot until we got all the people out of the fields. Once they were out of the tree lines, then they opened up. So it worked out for the best. We didn't have anybody hurt or lost or anything.
Well, when you got back to the States, what was the attitude toward you when you came back to the States, and what's your reflection on what the attitude was in the country about the war when you came back?
I was from the South. I lived in Memphis, Tennessee at the time. I de-roased back to the States and landed in Oakland, California, went through my out processing, got on an airplane, put on my civilian clothes, got on an airplane, and other than my haircut, nobody could tell who I was. So I never experienced any of the terribly bad stories that you hear about. A lot of that had to do with coming into civilian airports in uniform. That's when you would see those types of things. So my personal experience was very benign compared to a lot of that.
Bill, what about you when you, after your second tour and came back?
Yeah, well, second tour was definitely different than the first tour. First tour of duty, we came back into McChord Air Force Base in Washington. We got off the airplane and went into a little room in the operations area there, and there was an Air Force officer that briefed us. And the briefing was essentially, hey, what you guys remembered when you left is different now. There is a lot of anti-war sentiment, and we advise if you go into town or anywhere, you just don't wear your uniform would not be a good thing to do. I never got in a situation where I feared for my life or safety or anything, but there were reactions of civilians that they would take out their frustrations on the soldiers and yell things like "baby killer" to us, when in fact, like today, we were just military personnel serving our country and doing our duty, and the questions and issues they might have had with the war would be more appropriately directed in a political direction rather than a military direction. I've been so pleased today to see the response and the reaction to our soldiers coming back from conflict in Afghanistan, Iraq. Whether it's popular or not popular, the soldiers are always treated well, and that makes me feel very, very good and very nice. On my second tour of duty, that was a fantastic homecoming. I mean, we landed in the Philippines. It was the middle of the night. There were hundreds of people screaming and yelling and waving flags and lights, and that continued on through our stop in Hawaii on the way home, and then arrival at Travis Air Force Base. And I went to Fitzsimmons Hospital in Denver, and when we landed there at Buckley Air Base, very positive response, positive reaction by everyone.
These two gentlemen are going to do walk-arounds with these two airplanes with Sam Bass in just a few minutes. But one last question. You came back and earned your PhD in history and anthropology. How did that come about?
That was interesting. Those who knew me in my youth would not think me to be an intellectual at all. In fact, I entered the Army after leaving on academic suspension from the University of Idaho as a forestry major and enlisted in the Army at the young age of 19. I ended up being driven. As a prisoner, we suffered propaganda, especially in Hanoi, propaganda day in and day out, broadcasts on speakers in the cells, all that. I always had a love of my country, and the propaganda never got to me, but I wish that I'd had more information, more knowledge of my country to counter all that enemy garbage. And drew on a love of history and made a decision as a prisoner of war that I wanted to teach when I got back, to teach history and to do that in a charismatic, positive fashion, unlike some of the history classes I'd had myself. So as soon as I retired, I went back to school. I had a plan of what I wanted to do. I went back to school, got my doctorate, and began doing some teaching as a civilian college instructor.
And you've continued to do this work to this day.
Well, I continued to be a civilian professor until 9/11 hit, which was only a few months after I got my doctorate. And then I was driven to go back and see how I could apply my academic background and my military experience to do similar education for the Army. But yeah, I've been doing military-related training and education ever since that day, yes.
We, in a moment, as I said, Sam Bass is with these two gentlemen, walk around the airplanes, but a couple of notes. One is Kyle around? Well, there's Kyle. This is Kyle. We have challenge coins for all of you that would like challenge coins. Kyle will have those for you when we end this part of the program. But now, Q&A. Who would have questions of either Jack or Bill? Any questions?
And I always tell people, David, that I am not shy and I don't mind questions on any subject. I mean, if I don't want to answer, I won't answer, but I'm pretty open and don't mind anything that you might want to ask.
And same goes for me.
First of all, thank you very much. Hey, how are your injuries after all the stuff you endured? How's your health now?
My medical health is pretty good. My orthopedic health is not great. Yeah, my back was broken. I had to have surgery and spinal fusion and all that, and my knees are falling apart. But yeah, generally I think my health is pretty good. I've got orthopedic limitations of things that I can't do, but it's mostly orthopedic.
Thank you for your service. I'm married to a Vietnam veteran. I'm sure you guys could exchange some stories. My question is, what happened to the American POWs that did die as they were being transported, or they were in the horrible camps? Were they just, buried there? And how was information gotten back to their family about what happened to them?
You mean on the trek?
Yeah, thank you. That's excellent. I had, and I can speak to my personal experience with the one other American prisoner that was with me, and I'm sure that case would parallel others. He died, sadly, we were only about 2 weeks from getting to Hanoi when he died. The enemy buried him in the same encampment where he died. He was, in fact, both of us were MIA the whole time. I was MIA the whole time in captivity till the releases at the end. It was unknown where his body was for a number of years. I had given my debriefing to the Army of about the general area where that camp was, so they had a general idea. But after the subsequent years, we had an organization called JPAC, the Joint Personnel Accounting Command out of Hawaii, that has teams of military and anthropologists that goes in and does really detailed work trying to find the location of American servicemen and recover remains and get them back to the States. After a number of years, Wayne's body was found, was recovered, did come home, and was buried. So that's the case with that one prisoner.
Do you have regrets that we pulled out rather than go ahead and try to win the whole thing?
Yeah, I do. I did very much at the time. We had sacrificed so much, the lives of 58,000 Americans. We had, in my mind, achieved our goals, actually, when I got back over at the end of 71. If we just stuck it out and hung in there, we probably could have maintained it. So I was, I had... The sound of freedom. I love it. I love it. One more. Yeah, I never understand people who complain about the noise of military aircraft operating. It's great, and it keeps us free the way we are. Yeah, so I had those feelings when I got back. I was never bitter, but it was, yeah. In fact, I'll tell you just a brief one. I'm gonna go over time, but I'm gonna cut this short. When I got back and I was asked about my injuries, my back bothered me a lot, and I was really in pain, and it had spontaneously fused, but I had problems. So at any rate, I went in the hospital at Madigan Army Medical Center where I was to undergo major back surgery. That surgery would keep me in the hospital as a patient for 5 months. I was 2 months in a circle bed, 5 months or a total of 5 months in a plaster body cast before I was released. But on the eve of that surgery, I was laying in the hospital awaiting. It was like a day or two before the surgery, and on the TV, I am watching the fall of Saigon, and the helicopter picked the folks off the roof of the embassy, and it was emotionally devastating for me to see that, to see us withdraw as we did. Those feelings have somewhat been tempered with time because on a subsequent trip back to Vietnam a few years ago, the end result after all these decades and all these years is Vietnam is doing pretty good. Vietnam is doing pretty good. Some of the fears we had for what would happen if we withdrew and all the bloodbaths and all, there were some problems, but things have sorted out. In spite of still having a communist government, it's very much a capitalist society over there today. So yeah, my feelings are not as strong today as they were then. And in the end, I was and remained a member of the United States Army, serving to defend and support the Constitution of the United States, and subordinate myself, what I did, my institution, to our political leadership. And looking back, the country was just fed up with that war after all that time. Decisions were made to withdraw, and that's what we did.
Good.
And I agree with that. We certainly we had everything working for us except the will to win in Washington.
Right. One more.
I was a right seater in the Mohawk in two of those sister countries in 67, 68. But two things. The names on the plane are the MIAs that were there approximately a year and a half ago. Some of them had been recovered. There's flags on those names. And the other thing I'd like you to mention is how much the Mohawk flew in both Germany and Korea. We talk about Vietnam, and we had 10 years there, but the Mohawk flew in Germany and Korea for like 24 years. We don't talk about it because it was secret at the time, but it did a good job there too. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a little-known aircraft to many. I mean, some of you may have never seen it until today. It was the most fantastic reconnaissance surveillance platform that the Army ever had. It did continue to fly in Germany and Korea for many years after the Vietnam War. And when the Mohawk was retired, there was talk that it was going to be replaced by all kinds of sensor systems and high-flying aircraft. The Mohawk was never truly replaced. That capability never truly replaced on the battlefield until very recently with the drone technology that we have now. But that was a tremendous capability for the Army for a long time. Yes, thank you.
Bill, are you going to be signing books?
I will sign books, yes.
Bill's going to be over in the bookshop afterwards, after we finish, and signing his books, if you're interested in reading his recently published book. And now, joining Sam Bass is Dr. Joe Massessa, one of the plane owners here, Mike Holland, and also Jack and Bill, if you want, welcome to join Sam and walk around and talk about your airplanes.
Okay.
Jack McCormick and Bill Reeder, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you, folks, for coming out.
Thank you, David. We're going to start with the Cobra over here, and we have Colonel Mike Holland, and Colonel Mike Holland has 900 hours of combat, 34 air medals, Vietnamese DFC, and the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry. And Jack McCormick will be with us, and you already know about Jack's awards. And Dr. Joe Manessa Where are you, Joe? Joe. This is his airplane, and we're going to talk about the Cobra first, and then we'll come over here. And thanks a lot, Bill.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about the airplane. You know more about it than I do. So if you'll come over and talk to us a little bit
Sure,
about
just,
it,
I'll
about the
give a little
power
bit.
plant, why it was designed.
Bill, jump in at any time. This particular model is an AH-1F.
Hold it up.
An AH-1F Cobra. Started life as a G model. And for those of you who are aviation aficionados, the big difference between where this started and what we have now is a curved canopy, and the cowling is a little bit different. The Cobra is the first helicopter that was designed from the ground up as an attack helicopter to support helicopter operations like Jack was talking about, and also to provide close air support for the troops on the ground. That's its reason for being. It's only 3 feet wide, so it's very survivable. The armament system on the F model that we have here is a little bit different than what we had in Vietnam. In Vietnam, there was a 7.62 millimeter machine gun in the front and a 40 millimeter grenade launcher. Now it's a Mark 197 cannon, which has 3 barrels instead of 6, and it shoots 20 millimeter. Very, very effective round. On the hard points out there are 2.75-inch folding fin rockets. We could carry up to 76 of those if we needed to on 4 stations. And later on in this F model, the outboard stations held tow missiles, which are wire-guided missiles, which are shot from the front seat. The guy in the front is the guy that's essentially the weapon systems operator and the gunner, and the pilot flies from the back. One of the unique things about this F model Cobra, if you can see it on top of the canopy, a series of steel rods, this is one of the first Cobras, first attack helicopters, that had the helmet-mounted sighting system. And what you would do is hook your helmet into that system, and either the pilot or the gunner would have control and look at the target, and the gun will slew over toward the target. The gun will shoot 20 degrees nose up, 50 degrees nose down, and believe it or not, it'll go 110 degrees either side of center line. So like for rockets, when you're rolling in on a target, you pretty much have to be lined up on the target to deliver the ordnance accurately. Well, with this gun and this system, you can be pulling off the target, you can be making an evasive maneuver, and the guy in the front seat can still engage the target. It's really quite a remarkable system, and it works very well. One thing that I get asked at air shows quite a bit, believe it or not, this is kind of following off a little bit. Those are ground handling wheels. This is a skid helicopter. Those wheels don't go with us when we fly. I get asked that quite a bit. The power plant in this has some commonality with the Huey helicopter, except it's a little bit more powerful. It is 1,600 shaft horsepower, and it's derated to 1,340 shaft horsepower because of transmission limitations. Very powerful. If you look up at the blades, and you're familiar with what most helicopter blades look like, these are 44 feet, but the cord width is about 37 inches. That enables us, when we're coming out of a dive, to attain a speed of 190 knots top end, which is almost unheard of for most helicopters of its day. And of course, it's very maneuverable. In the Marine Corps, once I got back from Vietnam, I did transition to jets, and I flew A4s for 19 years. And one of the things I like to point out about the Cobra is that in fixed wing, when you're rolling in on a target doing ground attack or close air support, you only have about 3.5 seconds of tracking time on the target. Well, with this thing, you've got 5 to 6 seconds of tracking time on a target. So if your hits aren't going where you want, you can make that correction, and it is devastating. It is very accurate. 3 countries are still flying versions of this today, Korea, Japan, and Jordan. It's been replaced by the Apache helicopter that everybody sees in the news nowadays. That's overseas. The Marine Corps still operates a version of this, the Z model Cobra, which has 4 blades and 2 engines and quite a bit more sophisticated avionics system. So it's still in use today. The troops love it because it's accurate. It does its job.
What was the range on it?
270 miles is what's advertised. Generally speaking, though, you want to have enough fuel to get you where you need to go to the forward air refueling point. So generally, 200 to 230 miles would be common.
And how many were built to start off? Do you have any idea?
1,116 were built. 1,116 Cobras were built.
Somebody asked me, said, "Now, what is this weird-looking thing sticking out of the side here?"
That's a Jack said a refueling. It's not. No, we can't aerial refuel the Cobra.
You refuel it with 5-gallon buckets?
That's it, yeah, over the wing. That is a system that has low-speed sensors in it and is primarily designed for the TOW missile. The TOW missile is fired from a hover. It's not delivered from a dive. And that particular system that looks so odd feeds various atmospheric data into an indicator in the back seat where you can make a correction for winds and atmospheric conditions, and it enhances the accuracy of the TOW missile.
All right,
Sam?
Well, let's talk a little bit about the OV-1 over here. Tell us a little bit about your airplane, sir.
Good morning. This is 18,000 pounds of Grumman American steel. Isn't that amazing? And we all think it should still be in active duty for many reasons. This is the latest model that was actually built and used. It's the OV-1D. I know a lot about this because I've owned it for 9 years. I don't know as much about the A, B, and C, especially the ones that this gentleman flew.
Let's just talk about yours.
Okay, this D model is, sorry about that, you all right? Okay, great. D model was made for commonality, almost like what they're doing with the F-35 now. For all the services, everybody was supposed to take one. Turned out the Army said, we want it. Nobody else did. So it could do close air support, air-to-air, air-to-ground combat, and sophisticated surveillance technology. It also had a large canoe on the right side. Can we go take a look at this? Large mounts for about, Wayne, was that a 15-foot canoe? The SLAR pod was a massive camera. And initially there was film in it. They would land on the ground, take the film out, go process it right in a little room, get pictures. Later on, even in the Gulf War, it was data link technology, digital technology, and they got great pictures. People didn't mention this aircraft, and it's many of the aircraft flew over 10,000 hours in Gulf War I in '91, looking for the Scud missile launchers. Is that correct? Right. They were retired. They were probably worn out after that, and that's why they were given back to Grumman to refurbish, and this one was refurbished in '82, and that's why it was active till the mid-'90s, and that's when they were given away to museums. I happen to be the 4th civilian owner, hopefully the last. But if you want to talk about some of the performance.
Yeah, tell us something about this, the engine, whatever, whatever you think.
All right, this aircraft.
About the specs on it.
Yeah, it's got a 1,400 horsepower Lycoming turboprops. They were the same ones the Army used on helicopters, so there was commonality there. 1,400 aside. 2,800 horsepower. Not bad, but not great for an 18,000-pound airplane. It does have a pilot, co-pilot, and Wayne here sat in the right seat as camera operator. It has a range of about 2.5 hours when I'm flying it. The military flew it 3.5 hours because they landed with 10 minutes of fuel. I'm required to land with 45 minutes or an hour of fuel, so they went on long missions with these tanks, which hold 150 gallon. They're 150 gallon drop tanks, so that gives it a capacity of 600 gallons because there's a 300 gallon self-sealing fuel tank behind the cockpit. So all the fuel from the sides go into the main tank. So really at burning 150 gallons an hour, you could stay up for 3 hours. What was your longest mission with these tanks? I don't know how they did that. They must have landed with 3 minutes of fuel. I think they glided in because I can't get more than 2.5 hours out of it, even when I'm pushing it. But for the longer missions, monstrous 300-gallon drop tanks give this thing 900 gallons, and you probably could do 7 or 8 hours for the very long missions.
All right, sir. We appreciate you bringing your airplane here.
It's my pleasure.
What does it mean to bring this airplane to these veterans?
Okay, when I saw this, and I'm a student of history and aviation, I've been a pilot for 20 years, I saw this aircraft, and I said, what is this? Where did this come from? It had to be a secret. They built only 375, 76, and this thing lasted for 30 years. It must be a special aircraft. Well, if it can go from the 59 through 1991, it must have been very useful to the U.S. military, and it was very, very meaningful to know what a small group of people were involved in this aircraft over the years. They were either pilots, maintainers, people who built it at Grumman, and they did very special, dangerous missions through very trying conditions, as this gentleman have said, low-level missions over Vietnam getting shot at. So it was a very, very dangerous mission, and very special people flew it.
Well, I want to thank you, Mike. Thank you, Joe.
My pleasure. Thank you for coming.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.